Planning a trip to China is a tantalising prospect, but not one to be undertaken lightly. After all, it's a country of 3.7 million square miles and 1.4 billion people. Our trip of just over 3 weeks will take us through 4 provinces, plus the big cities of Beijing and Shanghai. With rain already in the air on our first morning, we're heading to the Temple of Heaven. This is where the emperors of the Ming dynasty worshipped. It was built in 1420. Once you enter the main courtyard, the dominant feature is this. It's the Temple of Prayer for Good Harvests. It's the oldest building in the temple, and the one the emperor himself would use to pray for good weather and a good harvest. This building is the Temple of Abstinence, where the emperor fasted before worshipping at the Temple of Heaven. By the time we got to Tiananmen Square, it was raining heavily, though it doesn't seem to have diminished the crowds too much. Standing above the sea of umbrellas is the Forbidden City. It's the largest and best preserved imperial palace complex in the world. It has 9,999 rooms, just one short of the number that the Chinese believe represents absolute perfection. The building of the palace began in 1407 during the Ming dynasty. It took 14 years to construct and involved more than 1 million labourers. The rooms of the palace are linked by a central axis, leading you inexorably to the grandest, which were occupied by the emperor. This one is the Hall of Preserved Harmony. These magnificent lions stand at the point in which the Gate of Heavenly Purity is separated from the inner and outer courtyards. The tour ends in the Imperial Garden, which is the private retreat of the Emperor and Empress. Before going to dinner that evening, we'd been tempted to go to the Beijing Flying Acrobatic Show. It was certainly spectacular. The next morning, with a transformation in the weather and about an hour-and-a-half's drive out of Beijing, we're heading to Mushenyu, which is a more rural location for us to gain access to the Great Wall of China. In this part of China, the wall dates back as far as 550, but the section we can see today has its beginnings in the Ming dynasty around 1368. This particular section stretches for about 1.5 miles. One of the reasons why this section of the wall is still so intact is it's made out of granite. There are 22 watchtowers along this section of the wall, and whilst the pathways are usually pretty good, some of the steps were very steep, especially for people with shorter legs. There is an opportunity to use gravity and toboggan back to the base station. For our last day, against the beautiful backdrop of clear blue skies, we've arrived at the Summer Palace. By Chinese standards, this is relatively modern, being constructed in 1750. However, it succumbed to the ravages of an Anglo-French invasion of Beijing and was burnt down by fire, before being rebuilt by the Dowager Empress Cixi in the 1900s. By the time of the Qing dynasty in 1644, Beijing was composed of hundreds of courtyards, each in turn linked by similar lanes to the ones that you can see here. Over time, as the city has expanded, these have disappeared, and now there are probably no more than 1,000 courtyards left. Having enjoyed the rickshaw ride enormously, we're going to have lunch prepared by a family in their own home. This is where I met a new friend. At least I think he was, because he couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak Chinese, but we had a great time nonetheless. The next stop on our itinerary is Xi'an, but rather than fly, we were taking a high-speed train. The scheduled journey time was just about 4 hours, travelling most of the way at speeds up to 300 kilometers an hour. Next morning, in the company of our guide Aria, we set off to the east of the city, to visit what is generally regarded as one of the greatest archaeological sites in the world, the Terracotta Warriors. The army was created more than 2,000 years ago by Emperor Qin, the first emperor, to protect him in the afterlife. Although the location of his tomb was well known, it's located about 1.5 kilometers away from the army. The actual content of these burial mounds was not until 1974, when they were discovered by a local farmer. It's thought that the army, set out in battle order, originally contained more than 6,000 terracotta warriors, though only 2,000 are actually on display at any one time. Although the scale of the excavation is impressive, it's actually the individuality of each of the soldiers that really catches the eye. That's because each one is actually constructed from a range of body parts. It's a form of early mass production. Hall 3 was excavated in 1976, and these are all officials, so it was probably set up as the command post. The 4 excavated pits in Hall 2 represent archers, and as you can see here, horses from a chariot array. Although this archer is in a glass case, you can see how detailed his body armour is, and his hair. This warrior is a general, standing right next door to this cavalryman. By the time we arrived back in the city, the clouds had cleared and the sun was shining, giving us a good opportunity to have a look at the city wall. Although some parts of the wall date back to the Tang dynasty, it was substantially rebuilt in the 14th century. So what better way of appreciating that than by going to an evening song and dance show in a former palace? This series of streets is home to the 20,000 Muslims that live in Xi'an, and is something of an assault on the senses. Later that day, after a 2-hour flight, we've arrived in Guilin. The whole area is extremely picturesque and beautiful, and the area where we're walking now is actually what formed part of the original moat around the city in the Song dynasty. Apart from its pagodas, it's also well known for its bridges, which are illuminated at night. These lakes are also linked to the Li River, which will be the centrepiece of the next day's activity when we take the boat trip up to Yangshuo. The boat trip took about 4 hours, and the 4 of us spent most of the time on the top deck, watching some of the most beautiful scenery we've ever seen. However, any impressions we may have had about this being a quiet trip up the river were soon dispelled when a veritable armada of boats took to the water. As if the boat trip wasn't exciting enough, that night we were going to have another treat. An outdoor light and music show called The Impressions on Sanji Lu. The story has it that she was a fairy singer from the local ethnic community. She was incomparably beautiful and had a voice to match. The show is about her and her images of community life. The next morning, on our way back to Guilin by car, we went to visit what we would describe as a living museum, with this lovely Chinese lady showing us what her home actually looked like and how she lived in a traditional way.
I don't know. Ah, this is not that one. I know where you I just noticed there's two other little birds here. That's the kitchen.
Despite the language barrier, she put real energy into her little demonstrations and escorted us round the house with great pride. She also wanted to show us how well prepared she was for her next life, with a coffin already on its stand in the shed. This public park is one of the local beauty spots and provided a nice opportunity to walk alongside the Li River. It was also the first time in quite a while that our guide said she'd seen somebody actually fishing in the traditional way, albeit without the cormorants. Having spent the afternoon by the Li River, that night we were taken down to see the cormorant fishermen. This is no longer a commercial activity, it's done purely for tourists. From fairly close quarters though, it did provide a good opportunity to see how this traditional activity was carried out. The next morning, Hannah's getting tickets for us to enter the Reed Flute Caves. Actually, the caves take their name from the reeds that grow around the entrance, from which local people made their own flutes. The rock formations and stalactites have all been formed over millennia by water erosion, but the lighting is what really makes it special. Having transferred from Guilin to Chengdu, the next day we took a full-day excursion to see the Lishan Buddha. Unfortunately, because of road closures on the motorway and then the side roads, we got forced into using some very narrow lanes, through which some of the larger vehicles were having some difficulty. Eventually we cleared the traffic and arrived in Leishan in time to catch the boat to go and see the Buddha. Built during the Tang dynasty, it's 233 feet tall and sits at the confluence of 3 rivers. Thousands of workers were involved in its construction, and it took 90 years to complete the carving. Unfortunately, the queues were too long by the time we got there for us to take the path round by the Buddha. We were, however, able to drive up to the Buddhist temple and get some really good views from there. Although Chengdu is not the only panda research station in China, it's the one most accessible to tourists. So we've arrived as early as we can to try and get to the key places before the crowds get too big. Although there are about 120 pandas living here, at any one time there are no more than 20 to 25 actually on show to the public. Whilst the adult pandas obviously come in for a lot of attention, it's the building where the babies are being looked after that causes the most interest. And because there are so many people, strictly speaking, you're not supposed to stop and take photographs, but simply keep moving. But of course nobody does that. After seeing the pandas, we took another flight southwest, down to a rather beautiful town called Lijiang. The old town, which has been listed as a World Cultural Heritage Site by UNESCO, can trace its history back to 476 BC. Our guide whilst we were staying here was called Maria, and she's from one of the ethnic minority groups called the Nashi people. The first site that she took us to see was Tiger Leaping Gorge. The Chinese think this is the deepest gorge in the world. That may or may not be accurate, but we're heading down this pathway about 1.5 miles, thank you Maria, to a point where there is a large rock, where legend has it that a tiger trying to escape from hunters used the rock as a platform to leap across the Jingsha River, escaping hunters who were trying to capture him. Having got to the rock, it certainly takes a stretch of the imagination to believe the legend, but the magnificence of the scenery certainly can't be doubted. Next morning we had a picturesque start to the day. At the Black Dragon Pool. The intention had been to get some nice reflection photographs of the Jade Dragon Mountain in the lake, but as you can see the cloud was against us. However, a visit to the Nashi village and the Embroidery Institute proved absolutely fascinating.
Calligraphy, so I need to tell her about how to connect the spirit. For calligraphers work is how to show the spirit continuously from the very big skill. Need very special training for that.
No.
In the whole region till now, only 3 masters and 5 teachers know how to do this.
How to do that?
Free tuition, free lunch, also free material for the people.
After we left the village, we took a short car ride up to the cable car station, which will take us about halfway up the mountain, something like 8,000 feet.
Red panda.
Well, there were 800 red pandas.
In Sichuan, Chengdu.
80 red pandas.
2012.
We never did get a clear view of the Jade Mountain, at least not until we were leaving the next day on our way to Dali. En route, our new guide, Rosemary, took us to a small town called Zizu, about 18 kilometers north of Dali. It's home to the Bai people. This small town, about 32,000 people, is well known for its highly decorated buildings and for its agriculture. Being located between Lake Erhai and the mountains, it benefits from extremely fertile soil. Next morning we took a trip on the lake ourselves in one of these very large boats. Soon after casting off, we were taken below decks ready for our folk dance performance, which was actually very good and certainly very colourful in their beautiful costumes. Our itinerary said we would also get a tea ceremony. Well, this is it. Although she did come round 3 times. After leaving Dali, we continued our journey east to Kunming, the prime purpose of which was to visit the stone forest. The part that we're going to see is just a small fragment of the whole area, which in total is about 400 square kilometres. Looking at it now, it's hard to believe this was once under the sea, but through 270 million years of erosion, these limestone rocks of quite fantastical shapes have been left.
Originally, it looks like sharp swords powered to the sky. Same earthquake. That is the opposite. Later, the volcano.
As with most of the places we visited, this one abounds with legends about the rocks. In this case, it's of a beautiful Sani girl called Ashima, and if you look closely you'll see her standing by the lake. The following day we were on the move again to our last destination, Shanghai. It's the largest city in China by some way, with a population of 24 million. and it's more than 80 kilometers across. There's a saying in China that sometimes it's the smallest package that contained the most magnificent gift, and that was true in the case of this house. It's the garden of the master of the nets in an ancient city called Suzhou. Although the garden can trace its history back to the Song dynasty, it's actually named after a Chinese bureaucrat who lived here and restored the garden in the 19th century.
The garden owner, he was a scholar, so he kept a big space for the library. It's bigger than the living rooms. Yeah. Early morning, he liked to get here to read a book.
Apart from its many gardens, Suzhou still retains much of its old city wall, including some very ancient bridges dating back to the Song dynasty. Suzhou is also home to the #1 silk factory. And these little creatures are what it's all about, feeding on their mulberry leaves. Here the cocoons are being sorted to separate the doubles from the singles, because the doubles are said to be of lower quality. This lady is stretching the double cocoons after washing them. The stretching process continues until there are about 18 layers built up to form a duvet. There are still many canals in the city, and it is often compared to Venice, though for my taste the boats were just a bit too big for that. Bund was situated very close to our hotel, and I can see why it's been called a Museum of International Architecture. Before the 1840s, however, it was simply a narrow, muddy river with reeds growing in it. But a building boom in the late 19th and 20th centuries soon saw it becoming a major financial centre. Quite unlike another building not that far away, the Jade Buddha Temple.
All this lot, that is a medicine food. This one is 200 years old. Takes a long time to get it.
This intimidating looking creature was what welcomed us to the Yuyuan Gardens. They're 400 years old, dating back to the Ming dynasty. They were finished in 1577 by a government officer who wanted to create a place of peace and tranquility for his parents. By the time we'd finished going round the gardens, the weather had really closed in, which was a great shame because we were going up the Shanghai World Financial Center tower to get a view of the city. Occasionally we did, in between the puffs of cloud drifting by. You're looking here at Fangshen Bridge, which means setting the fish free bridge. Built in 1571 in a small town in a suburb of Shanghai called Zhuhaijiao. It was a fascinating little place which, if anything, was even more like Venice than Suzhou. Its history dates back 1700 years, and it's probably the best preserved of the 4 remaining old towns of Shanghai. Unfortunately, just as we decided to try one of the little boats, the rain arrived, affecting a good part of eastern China, being the tailwash of a tropical storm off Taiwan. As it happened, the sign on the jetty was quite prophetic. Not only was this the end of our boat trip, but it was the end of our journey around China. It was a pity it ended on a damp note, but there'd been a lot of sunshine along the way.